We're really excited to begin this work with the University of Michigan and all the students as part of this class. U of M, I'm not a graduate of the University of Michigan, but in my previous role in economic development with the state's economic development organization, I did cover business development and retention activities for businesses in the greater Ann Arbor region. So anytime I can get down to Ann Arbor, maybe go to Frida Batido's for lunch, explore some of the wonderful shops and the great things that Ann Arbor has to offer. I think it's certainly one of the best cities in communities, not just in Michigan, but really around the nation. So again, excited to work with all of you, and we'll jump right into today's presentation. So as I go through today's presentation, what a couple of things I want for the students to really think about is think about your first job and then also think about your dream job. And when we think about our first job that we had, so my first job I ever had, my first job that I received a paycheck for was being a newspaper delivery boy on a paper route in Hazlet, Michigan, just outside of Lansing. Grew up there, and at the age of 13, I had a paper route of about 450 houses. I'd wake up at 5 a.m. on a Sunday, and I'd go out and I would deliver newspapers to a fairly sizable neighborhood in my hometown. Now, how much has the demand for or the need for newspaper delivery individuals, people to continue having jobs, how much has that changed given the role of digital technology now and the way in which people consume mass media? Has that role kind of been reduced or in some cases probably eliminated? And then what other opportunities have come forth as a result of those advances in technology? When I talk about my dream job when I was growing up, when I first entered college, I wanted to be a sports journalist. That was my dream job that I had in high school and early college. How much has that role changed over the past 10 to 15 years? I started college in 2007, graduated in 2011. That job, that demand, really, and the skill sets that are required for journalists nowadays are vastly different just in the past 10 or 15 years than they were in 2007 when that was my dream job. So think about your first job, think about your dream job, but also think about ways in which those roles have continued to evolve. Think about the different needs in skill sets, in education, in training that you may need in order to land your dream job, or what things have changed in terms of the very first job that you had potentially as a result of advances in technology. Taking all of that into context, really the essence of the workforce development system in Michigan and around the country is to work with both employers and job seekers to understand the unique labor market dynamics that are inherent in a local or a regional economy, and ideally match individuals up with employers and their business needs while also providing individuals with opportunities to upskill themselves so they can receive and obtain the credentials, the certifications, the skill sets they need to remain competitive on a global marketplace. And given how quickly the economic landscape has changed over the past couple of decades, especially with advancing technologies, how much should and will the workforce development system continue to be, how busy will we continue to be in that space as new technologies come online, as new employer demands come online, as we have these shifting landscapes and dynamics in terms of the overall economy and the skill sets and the educational needs for our residents in Michigan and around the country. So as we think about those, we'll move through today's presentation. Again, I'll start with a very high-level overview of our organization and our member organizations that really serve as the frontline delivery mechanism for workforce development services for both job seekers and employers. And then we'll talk a little bit more about the project toward the end of today's presentation. So what you see on the screen, that's our small but really mighty team at the Michigan Works Association. That was a picture taken during an event a couple of years ago. We're actually up to 6 individuals now, not just 5, but 6 individuals at our organization. And the Michigan Works Association, the organization that I represent, we really focus on providing 3 key services to our members. And our members are the local Michigan Works agencies throughout the state, of which there are 16. So 16 local Michigan Works agencies or local workforce development boards. I'll probably use those terms interchangeably throughout today's presentation. Our role is to support those 16 Michigan Works agencies through advocacy at the federal and the state level. And so we work with our elected officials and other key stakeholders to ensure that there are the right policies and initiatives in place to best serve residents and employers in their pursuit of economic opportunity. We also provide a number of professional development offerings to frontline workforce development staff each year. This can range from very technical programmatic trainings so that individual staff members can become more familiar with the programs and the initiatives that they're offering to both residents and employers. We also do leadership training. We do a host of cybersecurity trainings for our members as well. And so all of that is run through our Michigan Works Association. And then the third area that we really focus on is around brand visibility to make sure that if you are an individual job seeker or if you are an employer in Michigan, to be knowledgeable or at least aware of the resources that our local Michigan Works offices have to offer. That's vitally important for a thriving economy here in our state. Now, our work could not be done without those local Michigan Works agencies. Again, we're a step removed from the actual service delivery to individual job seekers and to employers. It's our member organizations, those local Michigan Works offices, who are really at the heart of delivering those workforce services to residents and to businesses throughout the state. And so when we move through this project throughout the semester, what I will do is one of my roles is going to be helping to facilitate connections to key stakeholders. And some of those may be local Michigan Works agencies that have a vested interest, right, in continuing to support job seekers and employers in their community. But they're also on the front lines for many of these evolving needs and evolving changes in the workforce space. And one thing that we're hyper focused on, but are still trying to really wrap our heads around, which I think is where the students, as part of this class, come in, is that future of work. And how can we continue to deliver workforce development? How can we continue to deliver updates and changes to our educational system, curriculum, to match the evolving demands of the employers in Michigan and around the country? A little bit more about the Michigan Works network as a whole. So I mentioned that there's 16 local Michigan Works agencies statewide, and you can see the red dots there on the map represent the central offices for each of those 16 Michigan Works agencies. Each of those agencies, by federal law, the federal law and some of the key workforce development statutes that are on the books in DC have created a workforce development system nationwide that is led by local workforce development boards that really are charged with those things that you see toward the bottom of that slide. Facilitating local partnerships, setting the vision for the local community and other stakeholders to help drive workforce development efforts, maximizing the productivity and the success of businesses in their regions, while also being locally controlled, but then accountable to performance metrics at both the state and the federal level. And so we do go through a fairly rigorous process and evaluation at both the state and the federal level within our Michigan Works agencies to make sure that we are meeting the demands of employers, but we're also helping to support underrepresented populations of individuals that have been historically marginalized. And so we're looking for ways in which we can help remove barriers to employment for those individuals. We're making sure that as people are going through workforce programs that are offered at the state or the federal level, when they come out of those programs, what we should hopefully see is they're able to be matched with a job. They're able to be matched with a job that is paying a higher wage than they otherwise would have been able to receive had they not gone through a program. And then we're also helping businesses to retain those individuals in the long term after they've exited a workforce development program. Those are just a few examples of some of those accountability measures within the workforce system that all of our Michigan Works agencies and quite frankly, all of our local workforce development boards around the country are faced with each year in terms of measuring up to those metrics. This flow chart here that you see is sort of the workforce structure as it exists here in the United States from Congress on down to those local workforce development boards. It's probably a little, try to see if I can zoom in there on the screen. Um, Probably not pulling up some of the text on there. So up here in the top left corner, each year through the appropriations process, Congress will appropriate dollars to the workforce development system. And then there's four key federal agencies that have workforce development sort of as part of its central core and central mission. First and foremost is the U.S. Department of Labor. That is the federal agency that or that all of our local workforce development boards around the country receive. Some of their significant funding from is tied to US DOL. We also partner with the US Department of Health and Human Services, US Department of Agriculture, especially in rural areas where the population size is not nearly as large as it is in some of the more urban cores of the state. And then also the US Department of Education, primarily partnering with other educational partners at the federal level, the state level, and the local level. And so without going into a ton of detail on this particular slide, because I could probably spend all day in talking about this workforce structure, essentially Congress appropriates money for key workforce development programs. That money then flows down to the state of Michigan, and the state of Michigan has their own Department of Labor and Economic Opportunity. We call it LEO at the state of Michigan. And so that department in particular then passes down sort of a pass through of funding from Congress on down to the local workforce development boards to help fund key workforce programs like the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, like Wagner-Peiser Employment Services. And then we also have through the Michigan Department of Labor and Economic Opportunity other state funding sources to help drive other initiatives again that are all 100% state funded. So those programs would be something like the Going Pro Talent Fund, which is a key program that has been around for the past decade in Michigan that provides reimbursement dollars to employers who help train and upskill both new and existing workers at their facilities or at their locations. So those are just some examples of how the funding kind of flows both from the federal level and the state level on down to the local Michigan Works agencies. The one thing I will note on this is a lot of these programs, especially at the federal level, have been on the books for a number of years. And so one of the key federal workforce programs has been the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. That program or that funding source was last authorized in 2014. And so that received an update from a previous law, which was the Workforce Investment Act, that was passed many years before 2014, but we have not had a significant upgrade or reauthorization in a key federal workforce program like WIOA since 2014. Things have changed drastically over the past 10 years. A few things that WIOA in its current form does not address significantly would be things like digital literacy. It would be things like advancing skill sets in technology. It would be things like artificial intelligence. Those are all things that we're talking about in the workforce development system. And I know that our congressional members ideally should be aware of some of those issues and how they are impacting workforce development. But without a new law on the books, it's very difficult to then drive funding into some of those key priorities that are now facing the workforce development system. And so we've been hard at work for the past couple of years, certainly the past year, on trying to encourage Congress to reauthorize or update some of the federal workforce statutes that are currently on the books to help meet the reality of what we're facing in the workforce development system. Much of that is really tied and centered around that future of work concept that we'll talk about here in a few moments. A little bit more on the Michigan Works Network, just to give you a sense of the impact and the overall metrics and volume in which we're dealing with each year. Annually, our Michigan Works system, we're typically seeing about 1.3 million service center visits. So each of those 16 local Michigan Works agencies, they have physical locations. We call them service centers or American Job Centers. We manage about 1.3 million service center visits, both between residents and employers each year. From July to December of 2023, which is the last 6-month window, which we've been looking at, that we have data available for. We served over 500,000 individual job seekers in Michigan, and we also supported more than 28,000 businesses throughout the state. And then again, I mentioned some of the key advocacy efforts that we have through the Michigan Works Association. So I won't spend a ton of time on this slide, but it really does tie back to that flowchart of the funding level and the programmatic priorities that Congress and the state of Michigan sets for the local workforce development boards to think a little bit creatively outside the box, but within the framework of the funding and the programs that they are initiating at the local level to best serve their businesses and their residents in those communities. Many of our goals within the workforce development system are aligned with other state or federal efforts. Some of you may have heard of Governor Whitmer's 60 by 30 initiative. The goal behind that is to ensure that by 2030, 60% of our adult residents in Michigan have attained some sort of post-secondary credential or degree. So that could be a certification in cybersecurity. It could be a master's degree. Those all count toward that 60 by 30 goal under the Whitmer administration. And there are many other similar efforts around the country that other local workforce development boards are significantly tied to as a whole. So just one example there is that 60 by 30 initiative. Really, what we're dealing with in the workforce development system is growing the middle class, removing barriers to employment, and then increasing labor force participation. So how do we do that within the context of the future of work? And again, this is a concept that we've talked about. I think if you asked 10 people in a room, what does the future of work mean to you? You'd probably get 10 very different answers. So there's a lot of unknowns in this space. There's a lot of research that still needs to be done. It's one of those, workforce development, I think historically has been very reactive, where we have high times of unemployment for a variety of economic circumstances, and then we're responding to those high times of unemployment. During times of low unemployment, we're oftentimes responding to removing barriers for individuals that are facing chronic unemployment. We're also focused on ways in which we can help upskill and train individuals so they can be more competitive in the global marketplace. The approach to the future of work, right? Our fear is that the future of work is going to be here before we know it, and we're not really going to be in the best position to make adjustments to workforce development or educational delivery here in the United States, certainly in Michigan, unless we become more proactive and try and develop a framework of concepts and a framework of approaches that we could have so that our residents in Michigan are not left significantly behind when it comes to advancing technologies and skill sets and educational requirements. So the more that we can be proactive in this space, I think it sets us up for success in Michigan. And this is a hyper-competitive landscape right now where businesses are competing for talent, right? So states, as a result, are competing with one another to help attract or retain businesses. And really, businesses themselves are going to locate to or be retained in places where they feel like they can draw from a well-qualified, highly skilled talent pool. And we're hoping that these efforts in Michigan, especially if we can be more proactive around this concept of what does the future of work mean, we're hoping that by doing so, we can continue to make Michigan a great place for our talent to live, work, and play. But we can also make it a great case for businesses to help stay here in Michigan and continue doing business or relocate to the state to help draw from that qualified talent pool. Some concepts that I think we should begin thinking about, and I'll provide a few resources at the end of today's slide deck around the future of work. So I think I have 4 or 5 different high-level concepts that we should think of, and then some questions within those categories to help generate some additional thought for the group today. We talk a lot about artificial intelligence. I went to a few conferences last year into earlier this year that dealt with artificial intelligence in the workplace. Again, we don't know exactly the long-term impact that AI is going to have. We use AI, we use ChatGPT, we use other types of AI tools here at the Michigan Works Association, really to help free up some additional time for us to continue building relationships, looking for other funding opportunities to help drive revenue growth for our association. And we know that there are other significant uses for artificial intelligence as it relates to workforce development and education. So how can we, one question, how can we ensure that AI is used to create economic opportunities for workers without a bachelor's degree? And then how can we ensure that AI does not further exacerbate inequities in the job market for workers? I think we've already had a couple of case studies, and you can probably look this up online to find a little bit more information. But there's been some examples that over the past year or so where artificial intelligence has actually had built-in personal bias for organizations, particularly in human resources, right? So if we're using AI to help screen candidates for a particular position, how can we make sure that we're screening candidates in an equitable fashion that is not putting underrepresented populations or historically marginalized populations even further into a corner where they're not able to be considered or remain competitive in a global marketplace for the jobs of today and the jobs of tomorrow. So just as much as AI can be used to help benefit an organization and their operations and the way that we do business, AI also has very inherent bias built into it because it's created essentially by humans, right? So we need to make sure that we're using AI to help create a more equitable society. We need to make sure that we're using AI to help create opportunities for workers with and without bachelor's degrees. And we also need to make sure that we're not exacerbating those inequities through the use of artificial intelligence. Just a few things for us to keep in mind as we talk about ways in which artificial intelligence and advancing technologies could potentially impact the way that we deliver services to residents in the public sector, not just workforce development, not just education, but really any type of public facing service using AI for purposes of expanding those opportunities and that equity. The second point that we should think about a little bit further as it relates to the future of work is the digital skills divide. I come from a generation that we're very comfortable using computers and technology. I'm sure that many of the students, all the students in the classroom, probably very comfortable, right? Picking up your phone, being able to use your devices and your technology to do research, to make decisions, to help organize, to help plan. There are many cases in which people in Michigan, people around the country just do not have those digital skills. It is primarily, more of an older generation, so Gen Z or baby boomers that have more of a digital skills divide than, say, the millennials or the Gen Zs. But by and large, there is still a digital skills divide in the way that we are able to operate. And with things going online, things going digital, much more so, even just this call today that's happening right now. 10 years ago, we probably wouldn't have even thought to, call in over Zoom to do a presentation to a class unless you were taking 100% online classes at the University of Michigan. So what are some effective ways that digital skills training can be scaled? We talked in the last slide about equity. Can we expand digital skills training in an equitable fashion so that regardless of where you live in the United States, if it's in, Marquette, Michigan, or if it's in the city of Detroit, we need to make sure that our residents have access to digital skills training and also access and reliable access to technology so they can continue to receive resources they need to help support themselves and their families. And how can those programs within the digital skills space for educational purposes, for professional work purposes, how can those programs be made more accessible, particularly to marginalized communities that have not historically been able to access these types of training programs or this type of education over the past several decades. The other concept that we should focus on is worker inclusion. So when we talk about worker inclusion, we're really talking about involving not just the employers, and we talk a lot in the workforce system about being demand driven. And when we say demand driven, we're really talking about the ways in which we're listening to the business community about what skill sets, what education, what background are they looking for with job seekers to step into a role where they can be successful. So listening to the business demands on the demand driven side. On the supply side, we also need to make sure that as we're integrating more technologies into education, into the workforce development system, into economic development, are we listening to the voices of workers? Are we not only meeting the needs of businesses, but are we also meeting the needs of the working class community that are going to be filling the jobs, that are going to have to go through the training, the education in order for them to be competitive on the global marketplace? How can we make sure that we're hearing the voice of the workers as we're developing new programs, new priorities, new initiatives built around the future of work? And then what mechanisms can be put into place to ensure that the worker voice is being included? We can't just pay them lip service. We can't just send out a survey and then have them answer the questions and then not use that information, right, to inform our approaches to workforce development and the future of work. We really have to be embedded with them. We have to be listening. We also have to be responsive to the needs of the workers as well. So that worker inclusion point is critical as we continue forth in this endeavor around the future of work. All right, two more. The next one is around displaced workers. So, and this is displaced workers historically for the workforce development system. Those have been a fairly significant percentage of individuals that on an annual basis interface with their local Michigan Works agency or their local workforce development board. Oftentimes they could be displaced workers. And so these are individuals that might lose their job because the company that they've been working for 30 years decided to offshore some jobs into a lower cost market. So shipping jobs overseas to Asia or Europe or South America, those individuals are then displaced workers. And so rather than them being a displaced worker and then going to work in a occupation or an industry that they don't have any familiarity with, no formal background training or education, our role is to try and keep them into that industry, something that they are familiar with if they're interested, and then also provide them with the skill sets and the training and the resources they need to continue being successful in that given occupation if they so choose to stay in that job and they're just looking for a shift to a different employer. So what specific policies, as we talk about the future of work and technology and AI, what specific policies could be implemented to better support workers that are displaced, right? So how can we use artificial intelligence to maybe make recommendations on what training programs might be available or could be beneficial for the individual? Are there similar occupations that they may be well qualified for that they have not thought of? Are we using artificial intelligence to help prepare the individual for interviews? Are we making recommendations on what education that individual could pursue in order for them to remain competitive on a global marketplace? Those are all some questions to consider as it relates to displaced workers. And again, that equity piece is showing through on this concept as well. How can we ensure that policies tied around displaced workers are both effective and equitable? And then the last slide here, again, this is not all encompassing, so I'm sure there's probably some concepts that the class will continue to explore throughout this coursework this semester. But the last one I wanted to highlight today was those long-term impacts. So I know the goal of this class is to really focus on 2030, the future of work, right? 2030 is going to come and go. We're going to continue to have dynamic changes in the workforce development in educational spaces for many, many years to come. So what are those long-term impacts? How could these advances in technology, how could things like artificial intelligence reshape the job market over the next decade? Irregardless of artificial intelligence, the job market has significantly changed just in the past 10 years. And so moving forward 10 years, what's that going to look like? How could these technological advancements continue to reshape that job market? Are people going to need more stackable credentials? Are they going to need a different skill set for them to be competitive on a global scale? Are there going to be different educational needs that employers may have in the job place? And how can we make sure that our educational providers, both K through 12 and post-secondary, are equipped with the resources and the knowledge they need to meet that demand for both their students, their future employees, and the employers themselves? Job availability, job quality, income equality, educational attainment. Those are all also things that we should consider as it relates to the long-term impacts of the future of work around workforce development and education. Here's a few resources that I would encourage the class to check out shortly after today's presentation. The first is around AI in the labor market. Again, so how is artificial intelligence sort of reshaping the labor market here in the United States, and what efforts or approaches should we be taking to be more proactive in embracing artificial intelligence and also encouraging us to continue exploring the ways in which there could be harmful effects, but also beneficial effects for society at large. Similarly, there's also that second article there or report from the American Institute of Researchers, which is AIR. That's the role of artificial intelligence in workforce development. And then the last one is AI and the future of work. And that report was put together by the National Fund. Um, those are the three resources that I would encourage you just as sort of an introduction to the way in which workforce development and the future of work are kind of integrating into one another. Many other resources out there. Again, like I mentioned earlier in today's presentation, my role this semester is to help be a resource of resources for all of you. And so I've already begun to reach out to some of my contacts, not just in Michigan, but on a national level, to make sure that as the course moves forward, are we bringing together a list of reliable, engaging experts for all of you to ask questions, to draw upon conclusions, bounce ideas back and forth. And so that information will certainly be coming. I'm sure that Alyssa probably has some additional information that she'll provide as it relates to the remainder of this project over the next several months into the end of the semester. But if there's any questions that the group has, we'd love to take those right now if we have time. But also just encouraging you that, I'm here as a resource. So please let me know what I can do to be helpful for all of you as we embark on this journey together.